Every urologist in the country has heard the same thing from men over 55. I stopped drinking water after 6 p.m. and I'm still waking up at 2 a.m. And every urologist knows the same thing. Restricting evening fluids is the #1 piece of advice men receive about nighttime waking. And for the majority of men over 50, the clinical evidence shows it doesn't work, because water was never the primary cause. Gentlemen, what's waking you up at 2 a.m. is almost certainly not your fluid intake. And the mistake of blaming water means you are missing the actual mechanisms that the research has clearly identified and that are entirely correctable. I'm Dr. Emily Carter, a board-certified urologist with over 12 years in clinical practice. I've spent a lot of that time correcting the misinformation men over 60 receive about sleep disruption and nighttime urination. Today, I want to give you what the clinical evidence actually says. Not what the internet says, not what a friend told you, but what the research shows about why men over 50 wake in the night, what the actual mechanisms are, and what a corrective protocol looks like. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what you've been told about nighttime waking. I want to know what misinformation is circulating. And if this kind of clinical depth is what you're looking for, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Here's what you've probably been told. Stop drinking water after dinner and your sleep will improve. Cut out caffeine, maybe cut alcohol, and restrict fluids from 6 p.m. onward. Here's why that's incomplete. Fluid restriction addresses urine volume, but nighttime waking after 50 is driven by at least 4 distinct clinical mechanisms, and urine volume is only one of them. A 2018 systematic review published in the journal Sleep Medicine Reviews, analyzing 31 studies covering over 12,000 adults, found that nocturia, the clinical term for waking to urinate, in men over 55 was attributable to bladder factors in only 37% of cases. The remaining 63% involved hormonal, cardiovascular, sleep architecture, or prostate-related mechanisms that fluid restriction does nothing to address. If you've been cutting water and still waking up, that statistic explains why. I want to walk you through the 4 clinical mistakes most men over 50 are making, not habits they've chosen, but conclusions they've been led to by incomplete advice. Correcting these mistakes in order is what the evidence supports. Mistake 1. Blaming the bladder when the kidneys are the actual problem. Here's what the research actually found. After the age of 50, the kidneys progressively lose their ability to concentrate urine at night. In younger adults, the body produces a hormone called vasopressin, also called antidiuretic hormone, which signals the kidneys to produce less, more concentrated urine during sleep. This is why healthy young adults can sleep 8 hours without needing to urinate. In men over 55, vasopressin secretion at night declines measurably. A 2020 study from Maastricht University Medical Center followed 89 men aged 55 to 75 over 6 months. They found that men with frequent nocturia had significantly lower nocturnal vasopressin levels than men who slept through the night, and that the correlation held even when total fluid intake was controlled for. In plain language, these men were waking up not because they drank too much, but because their kidneys were producing dilute urine regardless of intake. The mechanism is not the bladder. It is the kidney's hormonal regulation of overnight urine production. Fluid restriction at 6 p.m. does not restore vasopressin secretion. The data tells us that magnesium adequacy, sleep architecture, and sodium intake all influence vasopressin function, and these are the levers the evidence supports pulling. I had a patient illustrate this perfectly. A 67-year-old retired teacher, disciplined man, he'd been cutting fluids after 5 p.m. for 3 years, still waking twice a night. His 24-hour urine collection showed that his overnight urine output was actually higher than his daytime output, a clinical finding called nocturnal polyuria. That's a kidney hormone problem, not a drinking too much problem. Once we address the contributing factors to his vasopressin function, sodium intake timing, magnesium levels, sleep staging, his overnight urine volume normalized and his waking reduced to once every 2 or 3 nights. He came back and told me he felt like he'd gotten his life back. That is what correcting the actual mechanism looks like. Practical correction for mistake 1. If you are waking more than twice per night despite fluid restriction, ask your doctor about a 24-hour urine collection test to assess whether nocturnal polyuria is present. This is a simple, non-invasive test that distinguishes kidney-based causes from bladder-based causes. The clinical evidence supports this as a first diagnostic step before any behavioral intervention. This is supported by the research. Mistake 2. Ignoring the sodium fluid shift. Here's what most men have never been told. Sodium consumed in the evening causes fluid retention in the legs and lower body throughout the day. When you lie down at night, that retained fluid redistributes. It moves from your lower extremities back into your bloodstream and is processed by your kidneys as urine. This phenomenon, called fluid redistribution from peripheral edema, is one of the most well-documented contributors to nocturnal polyuria in men over 55. A 2019 clinical trial from Nagasaki University in Japan followed 321 participants over 12 weeks. Participants who reduced their daily sodium intake from an average of 10.7 grams to 8 grams per day, without any change in fluid intake, showed a statistically significant reduction in nocturia episodes, from an average of 2.3 episodes per night to 1.4 episodes per night. The reduction in nocturnal waking was not driven by drinking less. It was driven by reducing the fluid load that pooled in the legs and redistributed at night. Here's what's wrong with the standard advice. Telling men to restrict water ignores the sodium redistribution mechanism entirely. You can drink no water after 6 p.m. and still produce excess urine at 2 a.m. if your afternoon sodium intake was high. Processed foods, restaurant meals, and even seemingly healthy options like canned soups and deli meats are the most common sources. The clinical reality is that evening sodium, not evening water, is the primary dietary driver of fluid redistribution nocturia. Practical correction for mistake 2. Shift your sodium awareness to the afternoon and early evening. The target supported by the Nagasaki trial is under 8 grams of total daily sodium, with particular attention to reducing intake after 2 p.m. Elevating your legs for 30 to 60 minutes in the late afternoon, a practice called leg elevation for edema mobilization, has been shown in a 2014 Osaka University study of 56 men over 60 to reduce nocturnal urine volume by moving redistributable fluid earlier in the day before you lie down. This is supported by the research. Mistake 3. Not accounting for sleep architecture fragmentation. Here's what's wrong with the common framing of this problem. Most men describe their issue as needing to urinate at 2 a.m. The clinical reality is more nuanced. Sleep research from the 2022 analysis published in Nature and Science of Sleep, reviewing polysomnographic data from 1,847 adults over 55, found that in a significant subset of men, nighttime awakenings were primary, meaning the men woke first for reasons unrelated to bladder urgency, and then noticed they needed to urinate. The urge to urinate was not the cause of waking. It was noticed after waking had already occurred. In these cases, the actual driver is sleep architecture fragmentation, reduced time in deep sleep stages 3 and 4, which are the stages that naturally suppress the urge to urinate through central nervous system inhibition. Testosterone decline, cortisol dysregulation, subclinical sleep apnea, and magnesium deficiency all contribute to this fragmentation, and none of them are addressed by drinking less water. The clinical evidence shows that men who address sleep architecture quality, specifically through magnesium glycinate supplementation, consistent sleep timing, and sleep apnea screening, report meaningful reductions in perceived nighttime waking, even when their urine production remains unchanged. The mechanism is that deep sleep suppresses the brain's sensitivity to mild bladder signals that would not be perceived during normal sleep architecture. When deep sleep is disrupted, mild signals that should be suppressed are instead noticed. That's the mechanism. Fluid restriction does not restore deep sleep architecture. Practical correction for mistake 3. If you are waking and not immediately feeling a strong urge to urinate, Sleep architecture fragmentation is a likely primary driver. A 2016 study from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine found that 400 milligrams of magnesium glycinate nightly over 8 weeks produced a statistically significant improvement in slow-wave sleep duration in 46 men over 55. Slow-wave sleep is the stage most protective against perceived nighttime waking. Additionally, all men over 55 who report frequent nighttime waking should be screened for obstructive sleep apnea, a condition present in an estimated 40 to 70% of this demographic and directly correlated with sleep fragmentation and nocturia. This is supported by the research. Mistake 4. Dismissing the prostate's role in bladder sensation. I want to be precise here because this is where the most misinformation circulates. Benign prostatic hyperplasia, BPH, or non-cancerous prostate enlargement, is present in more than 50% of men over 60 and more than 80% of men over 70. Here's what's wrong with how this is typically discussed. Most men are told that BPH causes them to need to urinate more frequently. Full stop. What they are not told is the specific mechanism, and understanding the mechanism changes what interventions make sense. An enlarged prostate increases bladder outlet resistance. The bladder responds to this resistance over time by developing what we call detrusor overactivity. The bladder muscle becomes hypersensitive and begins signaling urgency at lower fill volumes than normal. A 2020 review in the Journal of Urology, analyzing 47 clinical trials involving over 19,000 men with BPH, found that detrusor overactivity, not simply prostate size, was the primary driver of nocturia in men with BPH. The relevance of this distinction: interventions that target bladder sensitivity, not just urine volume, are what the evidence supports. The clinical evidence shows that pelvic floor training, specifically timed bladder training combined with pelvic floor muscle exercises, reduces nocturia episodes in men with BPH-related detrusor overactivity. A 2018 randomized trial from the University of Michigan followed 83 men over 55 with confirmed BPH through a 12-week structured bladder training program. Men in the training group showed a 1.1 episode per night reduction in nocturia, comparable to the results seen with commonly prescribed pharmacological interventions, with no adverse effects. Water restriction was not part of the protocol. Bladder retraining was. Practical correction for mistake 4. If you have been diagnosed with BPH or suspect it, ask your urologist specifically about bladder training protocols, not just medication. The evidence for structured pelvic floor and bladder training is strong and underutilized. Additionally, the data on saw palmetto and beta-sitosterol as adjunct supportive agents is modest but mechanistically plausible. They are not replacements for evaluation, but can be discussed with your doctor as part of a broader management plan. This is supported by the research. Here is your complete action plan. Step 1. Request a 24-hour urine collection test if you are waking more than twice nightly despite fluid restriction. This distinguishes kidney-based nocturnal polyuria from bladder-based causes. Step 2. Reduce afternoon and evening sodium to under 8 grams daily, with attention to processed and restaurant food. Add 30 to 60 minutes of leg elevation between 3 and 6 p.m. to mobilize redistributable fluid before you lie down. Step 3. Take 400 milligrams of magnesium glycinate nightly and standardize your sleep and wake times. Request a sleep apnea screening if you have not had one. This is non-negotiable at this demographic. Step 4. If BPH is a factor, ask your urologist about structured bladder training alongside any pharmacological management. Each of these steps is supported by peer-reviewed evidence. None of them require you to be thirsty. You haven't been failing at managing your sleep. You've been given a single variable explanation, water, for a multi-mechanism problem. The clinical evidence identifies at least 4 distinct drivers of nighttime waking in men over 50, and water intake is the least likely primary cause in the majority of cases. Now you have the full picture. You know what the mechanisms are, you know what the research supports, and you know the right questions to ask your doctor. Tell me one thing you believed about nighttime waking that this video changed. I want to know what's landing, and your comments help me understand where the gaps in this conversation still are. I'm Dr. Emily Carter. Blaming water for waking at 2 a.m. is one of the most persistent and consequential oversimplifications in men's health after 50. And the clinical evidence is clear that addressing the actual mechanisms produces results that fluid restriction alone never will. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.